Welcome to this second lecture in the Critical Globality series. Today, Professor Francesca Trivellato will speak about the promise and peril of credit and the expansion of private credit markets in Europe before modern financialization, and about how myths and legends about the Jewish usurer became integrated into the global history of capitalism. Francesca Trivellato is Professor of History at Princeton University's Institute for Advanced Study. She has published several highly influential books in a field between economic history, Jewish history, and global history. The Familiarity of Strangers, the Sephardic Diaspora at Livorno and Cross-Cultural Trade in the Early Modern Period from 2009 was awarded several prizes and is now a landmark work in economic as well as in Jewish history. Her new book, Promise and Peril of Credit, published with Princeton University Press, and I'm sure that it will also significantly impact our understanding of the history of commerce and how the Jews became so associated with it. So welcome to you, Francesca. We look very much forward to hearing your talk today. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Jakob Feld and all the colleagues here at Exilda University for this invitation. As a historian of pre-modern Europe, I'm honored to have been included in this lecture series that features cultural theorists of contemporary phenomena. I'm also humbled by the challenge of speaking to you, an audience that includes several non-historians, about the past. In fact, about a distant past that we need to investigate for what it was, a foreign past, but also to rediscover in light of the dilemmas of our time. To investigate for what it was and to rediscover in light of the dilemmas of our time. The two things may seem in contradiction with one another, but are in fact what nourishes academic research, and that is how it should be. In recent months, the word socialism has entered mainstream public debate in the United States as never before. For the first time, socialism is not used as a slander against political opponents, but chosen as a positive label by some progressive members of the Democratic Party and their supporters. Why socialism? Why now? To say what? Hold your thoughts, and I will return to these questions at the very end of my talk. For now, let me begin with the word that I chose for my title, financialization. Financialization is a recent term used to describe the growing influence that since the 1980s, the financial sector has been exerting on both national incomes and the international economy. It is such a recent word that it has yet to enter the Oxford English Dictionary, considered the most authoritative and comprehensive English language dictionary in the world. By contrast, Wikipedia, faster than institutionalized repositories of knowledge in capturing the evolution of language, includes an entry on financialization. Importantly, Wikipedia cites both positive and negative assessments of this phenomenon. It relays that, quote, financialization may permit real goods, services, and risks to be readily exchangeable for currency, and thus makes it easier for people to rationalize their assets and income flows. But it also cites a number of academics and policymakers who have indicted financialization as the root cause of the 2008 global recessions and condemned it as a major contributing factor to the income and wealth inequality that is tearing apart democracies across the world. It is this deep ambivalence that interests me as a citizen, and that as a scholar leads me to formulate new questions about the history of European capitalism. Until the French Revolution, feudalism was the dominant form of economic and political organization in much of Western Europe. But feudalism was not a monolithic system. Segments of the landed aristocracy cultivated managerial skills and engaged with the moneyed economy to increase the profitability of their properties. Moreover, long before the French Revolution put an end to the feudal regime, commerce was one of the wedges that opened fissures within the legal and social order, which textbooks often describe erroneously as static and sclerotic. Even in societies that valued aristocratic honor and inheritable wealth, commerce was not universally condemned, not even by churchmen. For any cleric who censored usury unconditionally, there was one or more who formulated criteria to distinguish between legitimate and usurious lending practices. The church itself needed bankers to administer its vast immovable and movable assets. The church, in any case, wished not to quash all profitable investments, but to rein in and govern the entrepreneurship of good Christians. The vast majority of the European population during the Middle Ages and early modernity period lived just above subsistence. This is an influential graph that some of you may have seen that depicts pre-industrial societies as stuck in a Malthusian trap, a perpetual series of mortality crises, famines, wars, epidemics that kept demographic growth in check. So here you see that from the year 1000 BC to the year 1800 CE, it will be a flat line. But if we change the scale of observation, the period from 1000 to 1800 of the Common Era looks quite different. There were two periods of sustained growth. The first during the so-called commercial revolution of the Middle Ages, from around 1100 to the Black Death of 1348, which decimated between a third and a half of the European population. And the second period during the 16th century, when the population finally reached its pre-plague level, and when the Atlantic nations of Europe launched their aggressive commercial and colonial expansion. Both were periods of rapid urbanization, when new credit instruments were devised or enhanced in their use, and when social groups whose fortunes were not tied to the land gained prominence. They were periods of turmoil, particularly the 16th century, when vagrancy grew to the point of demanding institutional responses. There were also periods when the expansion of regional and international markets put pressure on the established social order and its sources of cultural legitimation. Financialization would be the wrong term to describe either of these two periods in European history, if only because even the leading bankers of the time, the Medici of 15th century Florence or the Augsburg of 16th century Augsburg, continued to invest in trade, manufacturing, and mining, the real economy, while they engaged in speculative schemes involving financial instruments alone. That said, credit made great strides in all spheres of the European economy, prompting polarized and intricate debates about the place that finance should occupy in politics and society. Most of the scholarly literature focuses on public credit, taxes, bonds, forced and voluntary loans to government, because of the nexus between taxation, war, and state building. A rich literature also examines the stock market that were first created in Amsterdam and London in the early 17th century. A somewhat more traditional but no less important line of research reconstructs the business techniques with which medium-scale merchants and bankers operated, define risks that to us, used to air travel and instant communication, seem unthinkable. Consider that even in the best-case scenario, it took several weeks, if not months, to complete a transaction between Southern and Northern Europe, and several months and sometimes up to several years between Europe and the Indian Ocean or the Americas. In the rest of this talk, I wish to draw your attention to a particular form of peer-to-peer private credit, namely commercial credit, that is, credit extended without collateral and only on the basis of the borrower's personal reputation. An authoritative French dictionary in 1690 defined commercial credit as the voluntary loan of money or merchandise which is extended on the basis of a merchant's reputation for probity and solvency. This deceptively simple definition has several implications. Unlike the owner of a pawn shop or a mortgage underwriter, the holder of a peer-to-peer commercial credit instrument could not seize any property as compensation in case that the borrower defaulted, but had to initiate litigation in court. For that reason, in many parts of Europe, merchants could still imprison for debt when no criminal intent was ascertained. Their person, their physical body, stood in place of a pledge. How was it possible to determine a merchant's probity and solvency? With no individual credit scores available, they are an invention of the 19th century, no almanacs with detailed public information about a firm's net worth or range of operation, how could a banker calculate whether or not to lend to somebody and at what interest rate? The reputation that the 1690 dictionary regards as essential was built via a thick web of personal and epistolary contacts. Merchants observed each other's behavior in public squares, along the docks, in church or synagogue, in coffee houses. They also wrote each other with alacrity, not only about commodity prices, ship freight and insurance premiums, the arrival of a convoy carrying silver from the Americas, the outbreak of war, or the frequency of piracy raids, but also about the promptness or tardiness with which someone paid his debts, or the bankruptcy of a little guy, essential pieces of information that would not figure in newspapers. Reputation was as valuable as financial capital, but information was so scarce that reputation derived from a mix of hard facts and moral judgments. That is why merchants cared to cultivate their public image. For historians, reputation is a black box as hard as it is important to pierce through if we are to understand how private credit was mobilized in pre-modern societies and the kind of anxieties it generated. Bills of exchange were the paradigmatic instruments of commercial credit. For a millennium and more, from the 14th to the 19th century, this cashless payment method helped merchants deploy funds from one region to another and thus facilitated long-distance trade, be it in basic foodstuff or luxury goods. In the hands of expert merchant bankers, bills of exchange also function as speculative instruments of finance. Contemporary observers admire these bills, but also found them confounding. Few today know what bills of exchange are, but all through the 20th century, the word was far more common than financialization. Bills of exchange were once on everyone's mind and on the tip of everyone's tongue. Take this example from around 1615. An English traveler visiting Venice counseled those interested in following his itinerary on how to obtain ready cash in local currency. Return thy money in England by bill of exchange, that you mightest receive it again in Venice. In this version, bills of exchange function as a sort of traveler's check, what we used to carry on our trips abroad before ATMs and credit cards became ubiquitous. Bills of exchange were so common that they also acquired metaphorical meanings. And the next example is that of an Anglican preacher who invoked bills of exchange during his sermons, knowing that all his parishioners would understand what to protest a bill of exchange meant. Our prayers are our bills of exchange, and they are allowed in heaven when they come from pious and humble hearts. But if we be broken in our religion and bankrupts of grace, God will protest our bills. He will not be one with our prayers. Used by small traders, tax collectors, and international merchants alike, by the middle of the 18th century, this system of payment fueled the darkest side of the booming Atlantic trade. The majority of slaves' cargoes in the British Caribbean were sold for bills of exchange redeemable in London. As cashless peer-to-peer payments, bills of exchange were not equivalent to paper money because no ruler or national bank backed their issue and their value. They were first and foremost instruments of private finance. As such, they epitomize the efficiency and the dangers of merchants' self-regulation. We tend to associate merchant self-regulation with Adam Smith's invisible hand. In fact, Smith used the expression sparingly and ironically. Only in the 20th century did the invisible hand become a synonym of laissez-faire economics. For centuries, bills of exchange, rather than the invisible hand, symbolized the promise and the peril of self-regulated markets, the beneficial and potentially destructive forces of private credit. The opacity of bills of exchange made them into objects of awe and fear. Those who were not versed in the intricacy of banking were rightly suspicious of the ways in which merchant bankers manipulated currency conversions, fearing that in the wrong hands, these enigmatic bills, which had no value of their own, fueled oligopolies benefiting some and not others. So let's decipher together this particular bill of exchange from 1551 to appreciate the elaborate information that was condensed on a thin slip of paper, similar and even smaller than a modern personal check. So a bill of exchange involved a classic four-party bills of exchange, involved four parties in two cities. In this example, Mr. Salviati in London needed to send some money to his agent in Florence so that his agent could buy some goods or Salviati could settle a debt. Instead of sending a bag of minted coins across the Alps or from Lyon down to the Rhone River to Marseille, then on a boat to Genoa and to Livorno, then onto another boat along the Arno River to Florence, choices that run the risk of losing the money either at sea or to robbers, Mr. Salviati purchased a bill of exchange from a local banker in Lyon marks, the firm Giacomini and Gondi, who had close ties to Florence. The bill ordered their agent, Mr. Borgherini, in Florence, to pay a set sum in Florentine currency to Salviati's agent Cernigi. The risk and opportunity of these operations lied in the fact that the exchange rate was fixed at the start of the transaction in Lyon. The exchange rate is set at the start. Given the transport and information technology of the time, a lot could happen between when the bill was issued and when it was cashed. Only those traders who were best informed through their vast correspondence networks could take on such risks. Note that by the mid-16th century, when this example dates to, the banking system was sufficiently sophisticated to allow merchants to settle their payments via bookkeeping transactions. In other words, there was no need for anyone involved to deposit a bag of coins. all debts and credits were transferred orally or via correspondence among merchants who kept in close contact with one another. So in our example, Salviati made the initial payment to Giacomini and Gondi by a mere streak of the pen in an account book. Later, Borgherini paid Cernigi after receiving a letter called an avis, so a written note from their principals, and added a credit line to the latter's obligation in their account book. For the most intransigent churchmen, all bills of exchange, including this type, hid a loan, and as such had to be deemed usurious. But before and after Calvin made a distinction between consumer credit, where interest was prohibited, and investment lending, where interest was legitimate, many Catholic theologians also refined their doctrines in order not to hinder the expansion of commerce altogether and to render it compatible with good Christian life conduct. In 1582, a Florentine layman, the writer Bernardo d'Avanzati, summarized intricate theological debates with an iconic bodily metaphor. He equated the classic four-party bills of exchange, the one we just examined, to the blood that flows in the veins. By ensuring the circulation of currency, these bills made long-distance trade possible to universal benefit. By contrast, he called a type of loan that was disguised behind a fictional currency conversion dry exchange. This type of bill, he said, dries up the blood from the veins. It does not sustain the utility of trade, but only the utility of money. And this is a flow chart, without going into too much detail, that depicts a loan that is hidden behind a currency conversion. And in this case, the lender is guaranteed a 5% interest. There were also other types of bills that were even riskier and more complicated, and that similarly separated trade from commodities. So that's the important line that is drawn by D'Avanzati, the bills that fuel trade versus bills that are purely financial speculative instruments. In other words, D'Avanzati drew a sharp line between bills that were used as remittances and those that were used for financial speculation. This distinction was becoming more and more artificial, and that is why D'Avanzati reinforced it. During the 16th century, these bills of exchange increased in circulation and in complexity. They could now be endorsed and passed on to a new creditor. This is the back of various bills where you see several other signatures. Every signatory is liable for the bill. And in fact, this new procedure generated the rather widespread, if technically erroneous, impression that bills were like paper money because endorsement facilitated circulation. In addition, a new institution emerged in Europe, the financial fair. And at these gatherings, the best known occurring in 16th century Lyon, some 50 to 60 men walked around carrying notebooks in which they recorded bills drawn and cashed across Europe, each betting on the fluctuation of currency exchange rates, what today we call currency arbitrage. Financial fairs stood at the pinnacle of early modern capitalism and represent the first instance of financialization in the history of Europe, in the sense that the money market was divorced from commodity trade. They are, for those of you familiar with Fernand Brauddel's theory of early modern capitalism, they are the oligopolistic tip of the iceberg, or the third tier of Braudelian capitalism of the early modern period. The scion of a mercantile family and a learned polymath, Davanzati indulged in a moralizing tone, infused with nostalgia for the good old days when merchants traded in goods rather than paper bills. This tone places him in a long and illustrious line of commentators, stretching from Aristotle to Adam Smith, who pitted the ethical industriousness of production and distribution against the parasitical profits derived from financial speculation. But in the reality of the day, such distinction was not so neat, and the most arcane types of bills proliferated. 65 years after Davanzati, a provincial French lawyer wrestled with the same topic, but did not settle for the bodily metaphor, the pitted remittances against speculative instruments. In 1647, Étienne Clairac published a volume of maritime laws titled Us et coutumes de la mer, Usages and Customs of the Sea. Both this title and its author are today virtually unknown, even though the book was a veritable publishing success. As you can see here, after the first edition, it was reissued in 1661 in an expanded, revised edition, which we know was printed in at least 1,200 copies, which by period standard is an extraordinary high print run for any non-religious book of the 17th and even 18th century. And it then appeared in 4 more reprints. The 1647 frontispiece, which you see here, of an otherwise unadorned black and white volume, displays a motto, potent over sea and over land, under the coat of arms of Queen Anne of Austria, which was regent of France during the minority of Louis XIV, to whom the book is dedicated. Both instrumental and genuine motivations moved Clairac to assemble an anthology of recent maritime laws accompanied by commentary. Published in Bordeaux when France was beginning to assert its position in the increasingly competitive arena of international commerce, Us et coutumes de la mer was a means for its author to ingratiate himself with the monarchy after his son had stained his reputation by joining the defeated anti-royalist insurgents. But Clairac's intellectual project had broader ambitions. He wished to make available to judges and lawyers with little or no direct experience of maritime trade a handbook that would assist them in their task of adjudicating disputes among merchants, ship captains, sailors, and insurance underwriter. He also, this is what he says in the introduction to the book, he also aimed to confer prestige to the sons of Neptunes, as he calls them, as he calls all people working at seas, who had long been regarded as unsophisticated and inferior to the sons of the land. This dedication in this sentence is important because evidently Clairac was not an unabashed critic of the emerging commercial society. A devout Catholic, he did not espouse intransigent condemnation of the moneyed economy, of which there were plenty. As a barrister in the Parlement of Bordeaux, the royal appellate court of the region, and as a legal officer in the Admiralty Tribunal, he belonged to the urban elite but was not eligible to purchase a title of nobility, and was thus less threatened by the rising status of merchants than was the petty aristocracy. In his commentaries, Clairac alternates praise and disparagement for merchants and bankers. He heralds them as treasures for state and society as long as they behave honestly, but denounces those who act as profiteers. What distinguished the two groups? What qualified as dishonesty? Clairac never answers these questions in any straightforward way. Instead, he tells a story in which Jews stand in for fraudulent behavior with a rhetorical penchant that reveals the self-evidence of such claims for his readers, and a story that added an original and insidious twist to a plethora of well-worn stereotypes. His book is a compilation of existing maritime laws to which he adds his commentary. Clairac is not a deep, original thinker. He's actually he lives exactly at the same time as Hugo Grotius, but is certainly not of the same intellectual caliber, but precisely for that reason is interesting as somebody who channels what may be a more widespread views of the economy and financial economy, particularly at the time. So as I said, the book it reprints existing text. In this case, this is the 1608 edition, which is reprinted in Clairac, of a compilation of rules about marine insurance that had been issued in the city of Rouen in France a few decades before. And as he annotates the first article of this authoritative collection, Clairac veers from the main topic and writes, "Insurance policies and bills of exchange were unknown to ancient Roman jurisprudence and are the posthumous invention of Jews, according to the remarks of Giovanni Villani in his Universal History." These are extremely puzzling words, even for specialists. If it is true that premium-based insurance and bills of exchange were unknown to ancient Roman jurisprudence, and this is part of a legal debate that was going on at the time about the Roman antecedents of certain commercial contract, there is no basis whatsoever for contending that Jews invented either of them. Nor did Giovanni Villani, the famous Florentine chronicle who died of the plague in 1348, ever make this claim. However, repeated and expanded in the second edition of Us et Coutumes de la Mer, for the following 3.5 centuries, these lines form nothing short of a legend that captivated great minds like Montesquieu and Karl Marx, was broadcast through myriad lesser text, and inspired a number of counter-narratives. And that's what the substance of the book that Jakob kindly held up explores. Whether coined by Clairac or adapted by him from an oral tradition that has been lost, the legend of the Jewish invention of marine insurance and bills of exchange mixes facts and fiction and blends together views of Jews and views of credit that belong to two distinct historical periods, which today we call the Middle Ages and early modernity. I'm going to summarize here a meandering but very interesting narratives that carries through 7 thick pages. In these pages, Clairac recounts that when Jews were expelled from France by a series of kings, whom he mentions by name, King Dagobert, Philip Augustus, and Philip the Tall, Jews devised new financial instruments in order to retrieve their assets abroad, and every expulsion was accompanied by expropriation and confiscation. So the idea here is that Jews are very cunning and find a way of bringing some of their assets with them in spite of the king order of confiscation. As they fled to Lombardy, that is to northern and central Italy, Jews, Clairac writes, carried their invention with them. There, Guelphs and Ghibellines, the supporters of the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor respectively, found marine insurance and bills of exchange very useful when each faction was expelled from its hometown by its adversaries and had to shield its properties. The story culminates with the Italian exile perfecting the use of these financial innovations and bringing them to Germany, Flanders, and eventually to Amsterdam. Clairac assumes the Jews were sly and refers to them harshly, using a theologically inflected vocabulary. But the ultimate targets of his harsh invectives are Lombards, Italian Lombards, a term that originally referred to moneylenders hailing from northern Italy, and that soon encompassed all Christian lenders, especially those who operated north of the Alps. In Clairac's account, Lombards, having absorbed the teaching of wicked Jews, extorted usurious rates from naive Christian debtors. They were worse than Jews, he writes, because they were Christians who behaved like Jews. Lombards were also more dangerous than Jews because they were not easily recognizable and because Christian kings cozied up with them. At least, Clairac says, Jews were hated, treated as lowlifes, and continuously ridiculed. He also notes that Jews were obliged to wear a yellow hat, which marked them apart from the rest of the population. By contrast, nothing distinguished Lombards outwardly from reputable Christian merchants. Moreover, in 1247, the Church had passed a decree that ordered all Christian rulers or Christian kings to expel foreign Christian moneylenders, namely Lombards, from their domains. And Lombards had been banned from France more than once. But these rustics, as Clairac calls them, maintained undue influence at court, and in 1311 were readmitted to the kingdom on condition that they would become honest in the future and would abstain from all their bad practices. Unsurprisingly, Clairac adds, quote, instead of reforming themselves, these parasitical hypocrites became even more dissolute. It was only in 1347 that the French king finally purged his kingdom of them and drove them out of France. Now, all citations in Clairac's commentary are correct, except one, the attribution of the legend to Giovanni Villani. Villani's chronicle was a well-known text, accessible in multiple 16th century editions. It had a lot to say about Florentine banking, as well as about usury and Jews. Indeed, Clairac cites several passages from Villani's chronicle correctly, as when he recalls the date of the coinage of the first golden florin. Why then did he forge this particular reference? We may never know for sure, but here is a clue. In a commentary on the customary laws of Guyenne, which is the region of Bordeaux, that only survives in a 19th century manuscript copies, but we have no reason to believe was anything but accurate, Clairac cites a famous passage in which Villani offered what became the standard version of the so-called miracle of the consecrated host. So this is the commentary to a text that has nothing to do with Jews, is the customary laws of the region of Guyenne, and this is part of an exercise that most law school students in the early 17th century would have to do. And here he cites Giovanni Villani, Libro Settimo, Capitolo 136, Book 7, Chapter 136. And if you look, in fact, the numbering of chapters and books change over time thanks to critical editions. But if you look at the editions that were current at Clairac's time, you find that Book 7, Chapter 136, contains the story of the miracle of the consecrated host, said to have occurred in Paris in 1290, and better known today from its representation painted by the famous Renaissance Italian painter Paolo Uccello in Urbino in the 1460s. According to this miracle, a Christian woman brings a host to a Jewish pawnbroker. Once the Jewish moneylenders throws the host into the fire, the host bleeds. Proof that it was the body of Christ. The woman is punished, and the Jew is burnt at the stake. One of the most widespread and inimical tales of Christian medieval anti-Semitism, the miracle of the consecrated host was meant to strengthen popular belief in transubstantiation, the Catholic doctrine according to which during Mass the host is transformed into the real body of Christ. It did so by drawing an ironclad analogy between usury and blood libel, the myth according to which Jews murder Christian infants to extract their blood. In the minds of Christian readers, the name of Villani likely conjured up this narrative, in which Jews' religious and economic infidelity were inseparable. From his humanist and legal education in Bordeaux, Clairac had absorbed a tendency to regard the Middle Ages, rather than classical antiquity or biblical times, as a foundational epoch in the making of French and European civilization. But unlike the more learned savant of his time, he had no knowledge of Jewish history other than the dates of Jews' expulsion from the French kingdom, which he cited, and these very insidious views of Jews and Judaism shaped by churchmen. In any case, Clairac was not interested in Jews per se. Rather, he deployed them as a trope to address his real concern, the growing influence of private finance as evidenced by the increasing diffusion and intricacy of marine insurance and especially bills of exchange. Like Davanzati, Clairac did not censor the use of bills of exchange altogether, but unlike Davanzati, he was not ready to condemn all forms of financial speculation because he knew how embedded in commercial practice they had become. So where to draw the line? Civil law established no firm criteria. Then, like now, the complexity of commercial credit perpetually exceeded the regulatory frameworks set in place to tame its risks. Faced with this legal vacuum, Clairac latched onto a stockpile of erudite and popular anti-Jewish imagery whose allegorical symmetry, equating Jews with economic treachery, his readers took for granted. Nothing prevented good Christian merchants from using bills of exchange properly, but if they resorted to the same credit instruments for purely egotistical goals, they deserved to be called Jewish. Clairac, in his commentary that I showed you before, when he speaks of Lombards, he calls them imitators, disciples, apprentices, and wretched clerks of Jews. These are his words. By accusing Christian bankers of being Judaizers, he summoned a well-established trope. During the medieval commercial revolution, the verb to Judaize became the cornerstone of a discursive vocabulary in which Christian usurers were cast as baptized Jews. This is a famous passage in which peius Judaizare, to behave in a manner even worse than Jews, is how the monk Bernard de Clairvaux described the conduct of Christian moneylenders, adding that it would be more appropriate to call them baptized Jews. 3 centuries later, the Dominican preacher Saint Vincent Ferrer railed, you can see here, today nearly everything is avarice, for almost everyone commits usury, which used not to be done except by Jews, but today Christians do it too, as if they were Jews. This penchant for portraying Christian merchants who engage in unacceptable behavior as Jews gained traction in 17th century Bordeaux for 2 reasons. the presence of a significant number of Jewish converts to Catholicism, and the changing legal and social status of international merchants. It is well known that forced and semi-coerced conversions to Catholicism became ever more frequent in Spain after the massacres of Jews in 1391 and the ban of Muslims in 1502. Baptized Jews and baptized Muslims, rather than religious infidels or heretics, became the objects of fear and regulation. The fear that they were undetectable and yet pulling the strings of power, that they contaminated a Catholic society which was imagined to be under constant assault from internal religious enemies. Paradoxically, across the Iberian Peninsula, the very institutions that promoted conversion also dreaded its consequences, and the indiscernible convert became a veritable obsession, not only for ecclesiastical and secular authors, but also for writers, artists, and ordinary folk. So for those who are not familiar with this chronology, the period after the 1391 pogroms, there was a period of not forced, but not mandated by law, but mass conversions in regions of France. The modern Inquisition in Spain was established before 1492, and in 1492, Jews were either expelled, had the choice of either leave the peninsula or be baptized. A number of them went to Portugal, where only for 5 years they were allowed to reside as Jews in return from a heavy tax. And then after 1497, they were obliged to convert, but at the time in Portugal, there existed no Inquisition. So this span of about 40 years is usually considered the so-called golden age of Marranos, which is the derogative term for former Jews who have been baptized, because although they were certainly not well regarded, they could live in Portugal. There were notable cases of violence, but there was not a royal inquisition that investigated in their behavior. We often forget that Iberia was not the only region of Europe where crypto-Judaism became an institutionalized reality. In 1550, the King of France invited, and this is the text of the edict, merchants and other Portuguese known as New Christians to come and live in the southwest of the kingdom. Everyone understood what these words meant. And that's because of this history up here. It was understood that Portuguese Jews meant those former Jews who had been baptized in Spain or Portugal. The timing of the French king's invitation to merchants and other Portuguese known as New Christians to settle in the southwest thus coincided with the first exodus of Marranos from Portugal. The 1515 edict included some extraordinary concessions. These immigrants would not be considered foreigners, but would be automatically granted the status of subjects of the French kingdom, régnicole. And that meant that they could not be expropriated when they died, which was the practice with all other foreigners. They were also free to move, and they could engage in any economic activity they chose, and as I said, bequeath their assets. So they were treated as other French subjects of the kingdom. In the wake of the 1550 decree, growing numbers of New Christians trickled across the border. Most of them traversed France on their way to Amsterdam or Hamburg, where they could live openly as Jews, but a few made Bordeaux and neighboring towns their home. In 1636, by official count, Bordeaux housed 260 Portuguese and Spanish residents, which reached some 1,500 by the mid-18th century, when the port city played a major role in the Atlantic transport of commodities and human cargo. They were hardly all rich, but a disproportionate number of them was involved in local, regional, and international trade. New Christian merchants assumed a particularly significant role at the end of the 12 Years' Truce between Spain and the United Provinces in 1621, when commerce between the two countries was officially suspended, and they carved out corridors of contraband connecting Iberia to Northern Europe markets in cooperation with their kith and kin in Amsterdam. Meanwhile, Count Duke Olivares, the Spanish king's right-hand man, wooed affluent New Christian bankers from Lisbon to Madrid to replenish the royal coffers, but was accused of being manipulated by Jews. He and his bankers fell in disgrace. Among the New Christians who fled Iberia, a few prominent figures occasionally return for brief visits carrying the requisite licenses. Many more crossed the Franco-Spanish border at their own peril and often encounter the arm of the Spanish Inquisition. Although a Catholic monarchy, France did not have a modern Inquisition. As a result, those Portuguese who came to live in Bordeaux and its surroundings after 1550, although perpetually suspected of being crypto-Jews, could escape the worst kind of persecution. New Christians in the southwest of France were nonetheless antagonized by the clergy, by local population, which saw them as both religious enemies and political traitors because of the perpetual wars between Spain and France, and by those merchants, wine producers, insurance underwriters, and bankers who felt threatened by real and imaginary competition. It fell on the king, who regarded them as an economic assets to ensure their protection and well-being. Until 1723, the open practice of Judaism was forbidden in France, but wary of the negative consequences that the departure of New Christian merchants would have on the commerce of Bordeaux, crown officials tolerated their presence as an open secret. Just to give you an example of what this meant, in a letter of 1688, a monarchy official in the region of Bordeaux, writing to Paris, spoke of, quote, the Jews who reside in this province under the name of Portuguese. So everybody knew who this population was, and the monarchy was trying to protect them for economic reasons. And these are two images that probably give you the most palpable visual sense of how acculturated these Sephardic merchants were. This, unfortunately, doesn't come from Bordeaux, but we don't have contemporary 17th century images, but it's even more powerful because it comes from Venice, where there existed a ghetto. But this is the portrait of a wealthy Sephardic merchants, a wealthy New Christian merchants who by then lived as a Jew in the Venetian ghetto. And this is a marital contract between two Jewish family on the occasion of the marital union of the bride and the groom, which, as required, is written in Aramaic, but the signatories, long after the practice of Judaism had been authorized in 1723, still sign in French Latin, with their names in French Latin letters. These are deeply acculturated. This is a deeply acculturated group. While bills of exchange increased in sophistication, and baptized Jews asserted themselves as a merchant community to reckon with in Bordeaux, a parallel phenomenon was underway. In Europe's principal commercial hubs, local and foreign merchants involved in international trade operated more and more independently from corporate organizations like guilds or consular jurisdictions. Institutional variation in this regard was considerable. Only in Amsterdam were foreign merchants not subject to any legal discrimination. In return for foregoing all institutional autonomy, they were given full access to the same financial and judicial services as local citizens. But elsewhere too, across early modern Europe, the definition of who was an international merchant became less and less tied to a guild structure. To put it simply, during the 16th and 17th centuries, bills of exchange became more abstract at the same time as social hierarchies were becoming more fluid. Early modern Europe's best-selling merchant manual was titled Les Parfaits Négociants. Jacques Savary chose the word négociant instead of marchand because it indicated exclusively a merchant involved in wholesale and usually overseas trade, and therefore a merchant very versed in financial instruments such as marine insurance and bills of exchange, but also because a négociant, unlike a marchand, was not necessarily a guild member, but rather someone known publicly as a merchant, a connotation that broadened the range of those who might be qualified as such, Jews included. Jews could not, in Europe, be members of guilds. You had to be baptized to be a member of a guild. By choosing this title, Savary crystallized changes that Clérac had witnessed firsthand. The relevance of international commerce for the monarchy and the social ascent of international merchants engendered profound challenges to the established order of the old regime. As in several other European countries, French aristocrats who engage in manual work, conducted commerce, or served as magistrates lost their prerogatives, including their much coveted fiscal immunity. This is as a famed lawyer, French lawyer, explained it. It is base and sordid gain that derogates from nobility. The proper course for nobility is to live on one's rents, or at least not to sell one's efforts and one's labor. So if you were somebody who was born an aristocrat and invested and in trade, you risked losing that status, and as I said, losing that status because of the rules of the time meant you had to pay taxes, which people think about it before doing it, right? Against much resistance, the French crown introduced new measures to favor noblemen's participation in long-distance trade. In 1629, a wide-range reform project championed by Michel de Marillac proposed, among other things, that those noblemen who invested in overseas wholesale trade be guaranteed fiscal immunity. It also recommended the ennoblement of certain other merchants. There were a number of proposals to inject new resources in overseas trade. The code was not ratified across the kingdom, but the setback was only temporary. The crown was determined to boost overseas commerce in order to compete with its Dutch and English rivals. By 1669, Finance Minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert succeeded in issuing a royal decree that, after describing commerce as an essential source of public and public wealth and as one of the most honest occupations of civil life, made maritime, though not overland trade, compatible with the status of nobility. This is a really overlooked but landmark moment in the history of pre-French Revolution, of pre-revolutionary France. A related principle was inscribed in the 1673 Ordinances of Commerce, which stated that everyone who signed a bill of exchange would be subject to the jurisdictions of tribunals run by merchants. That meant that if you were a nobleman who signed a bill of exchange, you could be tried by a commoner, which for this time period is a profound violation of social order as the nobility understood it. In light of this norm, as a jurist later put it, every nobleman, office holder, and clergyman who signed a bill of exchange lost their quality, that is, their legal status and prerogatives. In short, long before the revolution did away with feudalism, the French crown was introducing small but significant changes in a feudal regime and an anti-commercial ideology that had nurtured its legitimacy for centuries, in the hope of advancing France's stature in global commerce. So let me stop here and draw out some conclusions. The baseless attribution of the invention of bills of exchange to medieval Jews found its way into print at a moment, the mid-17th century, when bills of exchange had reached an unprecedented level of complexity and the age-old culture of inheritable aristocratic honor was being eroded at a faster pace than ever before. Written in coded words on thin slips of paper, bills of exchange could be hard to decipher, especially by those who did not handle them professionally. They had no intrinsic value and yet were capable of moving wealth across vast distances. No one invented bills of exchange, which evolved slowly from notarial contracts into commercial papers as the need to remit sums abroad increased during the 13th century commercial revolution. Over time, bills of exchange were put to new use, and in the hands of expert bankers and brokers, they were traded independently from the real economy. What constrained the most cunning merchants from using these bills for pure personal gain by tricking gullible borrowers? A practicing lawyer, Etienne Clairac, found no satisfactory answers to this fundamental question, either in the writings of moral theologians, whose classificatory schemes he found too rigid, or in the existing norms issued by civil authorities, which were either too strict or too vague or altogether inexistent. Financial fraud hid potentially everywhere and yet was seemingly undetectable. In Bordeaux, the invisibility of New Christians matched the increasingly inscrutable nature of bills of exchange. The figure of the medieval usurer functioned as a symbolic surrogate for missing legal lines of demarcation between good and bad credit, between genuine and insincere Catholics, between feudal aristocrats and merchants. The legend of the Jewish origin of European private finance cast the Middle Ages as a time when Jews, the assumed culprits of all economic crimes, could be isolated, expropriated, and expelled. The legend was a product of an age of confessional wars, conversionary missions, and dissimulation. After the Reformation tore Christendom apart and baptism was forcibly administered to Jews, Muslims, and native people at home and overseas, exterior identity ceased to be a stable indicator of one's inner beliefs. The simultaneous expansion of the paper economy facilitated exchanges between traders near and far, but also amplified concerns about malpractice and oligopolies. A piece of paper rather than a silver coin that one could weigh and bite was now sufficient to purchase goods or settle a debt in a remote town that one might never visit in person. Coinage fraud and clipping had long been and remained a major problem in marketplaces the world over, and it is not a coincidence that clipping coins was among the frequent accusations levied against medieval Jews. But paper credit instruments intensified the fear of fraud because they dissociated value from anything tangible. conservative theologians were not the only ones who felt acutely the dangers that accompany the increasing abstraction of private finance. Long before the invisible hand became an enduring metaphor for the idealized self-regulation of the market, many observers were ready to recognize the benefits brought by new credit instruments and the intensification of market exchanges between strangers, even as they worried about how to expose swindles and curb abuse. Good Christians could use these bills properly, but knowing that they had been invented by Jews, explained, within quotes, why fraud always lurked behind them. To attribute the invention of bills of exchange to Jews was to mark these objects of endless admiration and no less puzzlement with an original sin, and thus to give them an illusory stability. Now, how does everything I have said so far have anything to do with the embrace of socialism by the most progressive segments of the left in the United States? Obviously, I am not suggesting that any direct analogy exists between the current situation and the remote past that I evoked here. Nor, mind you, am I drawing any direct connection between socialism and anti-Semitism, and I want to be clear on this point. My point is different. In both cases, myths and rhetorical hyperboles are symptomatic of the absence of a cultural consensus on how to harness the potential of the market economy, and finance in particular, without succumbing to its excess. The invocation of socialism in 2019, in the most advanced capitalist economy of the world, is a measure of how far the pendulum of neoliberalism has swung. It replaces older slogans like responsible capitalism or sustainable capitalism, or more recent slogans like Joseph Stiegler's progressive capitalism, or other economists' use of the term inclusive economics, all of which feel empty in the face of dramatic income inequality and financialization. Those who call themselves socialists today in the US long for a new balance between freedom and equality, between opportunity and a reliable safety net. Not knowing how to achieve this goal, they invoke a word that is as exaggerated as surprisingly effective, at least in some circles, and this is what matters on some level. As historians and cultural critics, we need to take stock of these mislabelings. The Titanic confrontation between capitalism and socialism, with capital C and capital S, as we've known it during the 20th century, was a discrete moment in the long history of European economic thought and policies. Calls for the abolition of private property or all forms of credit have been the exceptions along a much longer, winding, and conflict-ridden route populated by more or less successful projects and demands for a well-tempered market economy. The legend of the Jewish invention of Europe's most advanced financial instruments of the time was an expression of quintessentially early modern anxieties about commercial credit. It seized on the image of the Jewish medieval usurer as a figure that everyone could recognize. It portrayed the Middle Ages as an imaginary time when religious boundaries and social hierarchies were fixed, when Jews were Jews, merchants were merchants, aristocrats, aristocrats. All around Clérac, the author who committed the legend to print, the opposite was happening. In his hometown, Bordeaux, new Christians were tacitly acknowledged to be crypto-Jews and yet allowed to live and prosper. All across France, the crown was chipping away at aristocratic culture by inviting noblemen to invest in overseas trade. Clérac turned the Middle Ages into a usable past, as have so many other authors and institutions in later epochs. He latched on to a story that, misguided as it was, allegorized the perils of increasingly impersonal credit markets in which mysterious financial contracts benefited some more than others and predatory lending went unpublished. It was the wrong approach to a thorny issue for which we have yet to find a solution. Thank you.